Call the workshop to order. We on here?
All right. This workshop is to provide the board an opportunity to discuss the MSBU annual assessment for fire protection services. Over the past 4 to 5 months, I've asked Brandy and Louie to really sit down and let's understand our MSBU and where we are and what we can really, to make sure it makes sense that if we have to ask for any type of increase that it makes perfect sense, and we went through all the scenarios to make sure we were able to substantiate what we're asking for. So through that, we looked at the legal requirements of the imposition of assessing it. We looked at the history and the background of the MSBU annual assessment rates, which has a very colorful past, I should say. We looked at the GSG study and understood that to get to the nexus of what all it meant and how they calculated everything. The actual data and revenue and expenses for the MSBU. And also Louis has worked in the past year now to restructure the Wakulla Fire Rescue Division, as well as he's worked on improving our ISO ratings altogether. This has to do with working with each one of the volunteer fire units, and I think he's done an admirable job of that and set up a new structure, command structure, that makes sense. That the good thing is, one of the things I'd ask them to do is look at what it's going to take to go forward, because our county is getting ready to really grow even more than what it is now. We've got to set the tone now for the future and make sure we've got the way paved. So there's a lot of things that was looked at. Brandy has done a tremendous job of breaking this thing down. As far as the MSBU is concerned, I think she can about answer any question that you throw at her.
Whoa now.
I think, but she has a good baseline understanding of it, which is what we needed. Over the past, we've had a lot of maneuvering with our MSBU. We moved from $65 to $75. Had a large fund balance. We've been in and out of volunteers are heavier now. They're tailing off, which is nationwide. We've got new structure, new commands. We've done our rate studies. We've set our rate, the way that our employees are allocated. That was the big tool. We finally got that down to where it's a defendable situation. So now we understand exactly what our budget's going to be now and into the future. And we also we moved all the capital out into the 1-cent sales tax, and those were big things that we've shifted over the years. Now we have a good picture of what our budget needs to be moving forward. So with that, just to let you know, over the past 5.5 years, we fixed almost every fund in this county. The general fund, we fixed it, and we reduced taxes a year ago. Sheriff's fund, it's on the way to being fixed right now. We sat down, we didn't back off from it, we attacked it through some hard stuff. Road fund, it was a mess, but we've managed to turn that around. The 1-cent sales tax fund, that was a fairly easy one because it had miscalculations on math all over it. We got that fixed. Housing fund, it was a disaster when we first took over. Solid waste fund is now solid. It's gaining, and in fact, we're looking at the possibility next year of lowering our solid waste fees, which is unbelievable. Wastewater fund is strong. We've got a good, strong future there, and it's growing, and it's healthy. And we're able to do with it what it's going to need to do to get into the future to anticipate on the anticipated growth. Court-related funds, they were a mess. We've gotten those straightened out. The building fund, we got the exact opposite problem there. We got too much money, but we're taking care of that too. We've set up fund balances for each constitutional officer so that they can address issues that they have into the future. So from a fund standpoint, each one of them, they have their own fund, their own semi-fund. They're able to control their future. So moving forward, this should be the last fund that we've had that we knew that we had to fix was the MSBU. But like I say, we went through until we were ready and we felt like we knew the numbers well enough. We were not going to present something that of this dramatic increase. So with that ado, I'm going to turn it over to Miss Brandy, and she can take off. Her and Louis can take off from there.
All right, thank you. Like David said, one of the things that I wanted to make sure that I really did is to understand all the history and where we've been with the MSBU to kind of figure out how we got to where we are today. So some of these first materials we're going to cover are pretty basic and simple, but I want to make sure we all start out on the same foundation of understanding just so we're all together. Of course, to impose a non-ad valorem assessment, you have to meet certain legal requirements, and the service must give a benefit to the property being assessed. Oh, you're going to click with me? Thank you. So this is not specifically to the homeowner, the people that live there. This is to the property. Any costs that are assessed must be fairly and reasonable, apportioned among all the different properties that receive that benefit. So those are the basic legal aspects that we have to make sure we review. Give me that. I can. Okay. The other thing is, anytime that we apply any exemptions from the assessment, they must be founded on a legitimate public purpose, and we can't indirectly aid any religious institutions. Any exemptions have to be reasonable and fair, and we do need to look at those exemptions to assess the magnitude of the fiscal impact on our public funds. Anytime we grant an exemption from the MSBU assessment, we cannot shift the cost onto the non-exempt property owners. So we really have to look at the whole entire universe that's available for assessment when we calculate our rates. We can't make a higher rate just because we know we're not going to be able to collect the assessment on governmental properties or institutional and tax-exempt properties. So we have to take everything into account when we do those calculations. You look like you have a question.
Just like building permit fees, you can't just waive them. Somebody's got to pay them.
Correct. Somebody's got to pay for them. Same thing with MSBU. Some of the exemptions that we have here are institutional, wholly tax-exempt parcels, governmental properties. We also provide a hardship assistance program for low-income individuals to apply for each year. It follows the HUD guidelines for ultra-low income, which I think is about $15,000 a year. And
did you figure out about churches? When we talked about wholly exempt tax parcels, are churches, do they pay MSBU?
If they're wholly tax exempt, then they do not.
Brad, does churches, they don't pay property taxes, so they don't pay MSBU either?
If they're, for the sanctuary, but if they had a daycare, that would be a commercial use.
We got a lot of churches around here, though.
One of the other ones that we have is the transient use vacancy, and we all talked about it. We don't have anybody that is currently using this vacancy. It's specific to mobile home parks and recreational vehicle parks. And the way it works is that each year, whoever wanted to claim that exemption would need to apply with the county administrator's office by June 1st, and then we would verify if they qualify. But nobody in the county is currently using this exemption.
I don't know about it.
All right, so this chart up here is just a list of our whole universe available for assessment versus what we actually get to collect the assessment on. So for residential, we have 12,825 dwelling units. Of that, we have 12,685 that we can actually collect the assessment. And the difference there is going to be your low-income individuals that apply each year. Non-residential, almost 3 million square feet. but we can only collect the assessment on a little under 2.4 million square feet. And the difference there is going to be your governmental properties and your institutional and your tax exempt churches. And then of course here for land we have about 340,000 acres, and of that less than $5,000 or 5,000 acres we can actually collect the assessment on. And your difference there is going to be your forest and your refuge and all your federal and state lands that we have here.
So you only collect assessment on 5,000 acres?
Less than 5,000 acres, and it was a little higher last year. There's a new legislative exemption that relates specifically to land designated as agricultural. We got some more details on that coming up, but this is another area where we do take some legislative hits from time to time, and that's going to happen this year.
Unfunded mandates.
So this table just recaps what we just talked about. This is our total number of exemptions for each individual type of property use. So about 1% of our residential dwellings, 20% of our non-residential, and 98% of our land are exempt from the fire assessment. However, we still have to take those into consideration when we're calculating our rates. That's very important. Okay, here's our detail on the new exemption. It's an additional exemption created on land classified as agricultural or buildings of non-residential property located on lands classified as agricultural unless they have a building that exceeds a just value of over $10,000 and is not a pole barn. So any land that falls into that category, which we had about 76,000 acres that are now going to be exempt in 17-18 that were not exempt for the current fiscal year. The fiscal impact of that is about $14,000.
Excuse me, $10,000 and not a pole barn?
It has to be a building that is at least $10,000 just value, but it cannot be a pole barn.
Nice pole barn.
Pole barns are exempt.
Pole barns are exempt.
Yeah.
So
So if you had a shop or something or a large,
somebody has a bee house on their property, and a bee house is worth more than that 10,000.
it's a heck of a bee house right there.
No, it's not. Everybody's got a bee house. If your barn is built out of poles, does that make it a pole barn?
If it's open, it's considered open
It's got to
size.
be open.
That open side.
Yes.
Okay, so say, just for a classic example, the arena at Harvey Young Farm, that's such huge, is that considered?
That would be considered a pole barn.
That's worth more than
That's worth a lot more than $10,000.
We didn't set that rule.
We weren't happy about it either, but,
Because they still burn.
They still burn, yes.
which is perfect segue into my next point. Regardless of the exempt status of property, we still have an obligation to provide service, fire protection services. Any difference between what we can actually collect on the available units, so the gap between what's available and what's exempt, that difference is our buy down, which means we have to cover that from either the general fund, 1-cent sales tax, any other legal funding sources. We have to cover that variance from other funds, and that's our buy down. We're going to talk about it a little bit more as we get into this. But for the current fiscal year we're in, it's about $100,000. All right, so we're going to walk through the park a little bit and just talk about the history and how we got to where we are today. It was originally adopted in 1985 to create the MSBU for providing fire protection services. The rate structure then was, they had a lot more different use types and everything: residential, commercial, industrial, agricultural, institutional, miscellaneous, and acreage not zoned agricultural. So it was pretty complex in the rate structure, and David's going to put that chart up there that shows each individual property use type in the rates. And then you had, so up to a certain size, then each additional square foot, you had some kind of adjustments there for larger buildings. But it's pretty complex structure back then when it was first implemented. But the main thing that's important here is we were at $15 flat fee a year for residential. So that was in 1985. Moving into, that's pretty much stayed the same until 1995 when we changed the residential rate to $35, so a $20 increase, and then we also approved to use the uniform method of collecting them, which is just basically the property owners receive that notification and it's assessed on their trim notice instead of receiving an invoice for services. So we kind of streamlined some administrative functions there to make it a little easier. That stayed the same until 2006. In 2006, our residential rate went up to $65, so that's a $30 increase. Now, what's important here is how we were operating at that time is vastly different from the way we're functioning and providing fire protection today. The majority of fire protection at that time was provided by the VFDs, and so we had 11 volunteer fire departments spread in the populated areas, and so you might have a different level of service if you happen to be in an area where you had a VFD that was less responsive, less active than somebody else that may live in Crawfordville where it's always been pretty active.
And that was a 54% jump in 1 year, going from 35 to...
Well, yes, it was 1 year, but it had been that way since 1995.
I understand, but in whatever year, 2006, it went up 54%.
Yes. In 2010, and there's some additional information to this, but we actually decreased that residential rate back to $61. This comes into play with the board requesting GSG to perform the fire assessment project study, and I'm not really sure why, because the rates they recommended were drastically different, but that was the final resolution. It was $61 per residential dwelling unit. And 5 cents, you can see the rate structure has been simplified. We got 5 cents per square foot for commercial and 14 cents per acre for vacant land.
And this is when the problem started. This is where the problem started. It was never funded the way it should have, and this kind of starts our new era. Okay, go ahead.
If I may add too, also, you guys, this shortly after this is when we also added the salaries of the career fire staff. We were still divided then, EMS and fire. We added that nearly $600,000 of salaries onto that while reducing it to 61. So that's when we started digging our hole.
So that rate stayed at $61 for residential until 2014 when it was increased to $75. The commercial rate increased to 6 cents per square foot, and then our land to 17 cents per acre. 2015, we had an increase again. Residential went up to $80 per dwelling unit, commercial just under 6.5 cents per square foot, and vacant land is a little more than 18 cents per acre. And that's where we are today. That's the current rates we're still at right now. So that gives us the history of our structure and where we've been. And then, like we said, in 2009, the board requested GSG to really do a comprehensive analysis on developing a assessment plan to fund the fire protection services. It was included as an attachment in the agenda item for the workshop. Did everybody read it?
Oh, yeah.
So the objectives of the project were to determine the cost of the service, determine which elements of the service provided the benefit to the assessed properties, and to determine the benefit by property use type. They were to recommend a fair and reasonable method to apportion the assessment among the benefited parcels. They were to calculate some preliminary rates that the board could review and determine to vote on for the full cost of fire protection services over a 5-year period. And they were also just make sure that anything that we adopted was compliant with the laws.
That's capital and operational.
At the time, yes, they had the capital in there as well, and then we also, at that point, each individual VFD had their own budget. So we had 6 career firefighters and a fire chief at that time that were county employed, but the majority of our services were still being provided by some of the VFDs that were responsive. So in order to do this, what they did was they spent a lot of time with Louis, and they spent a lot of time gathering information to determine what those costs would be. They looked at a snapshot in time of the call data, segregated out by property use type so that they could determine who's really using this service and at what percentage. So the 5-year budget that they came up with, and this is 10-11, and I think that I've pointed this specific page out to everybody in the study, was just under $3 million. And that included $400,000 annually for capital replacement. So fire truck, and a fire truck is roughly about $400,000 by the time you purchase one and equip it. And all of the annual expenditures had an inflationary factor of 3%. So just under, and you can see in 13-14 we tip over that $3 million mark. And so that it was basically all in, everything.
That's
all
what they
VFDs.
estimated the county would need to spend. That's not what we actually spent.
Correct. That's what they estimated the actual costs of providing the services to be. The data that they looked at was from May 1st, 2009 to April 30th of 2010. They broke down all the calls, and there was 571 incidents that they reviewed. There was 445 non-specific calls that were not used to calculate this because they could not be attributed to a specific property use type. An example would be like a car wreck or a tree in the middle of the road or something like that. So those calls were excluded. So the calls they looked at were specific to a property use type, either at somebody's home, at a business, or they were land.
Could have been Ceylon donuts or something.
The other piece of the puzzle was to know how many units of each different property use type there were. At that time, we had 12,039 residential dwelling units. And let me say one thing before I forget. Dwelling units is each individual home, so you could potentially have a parcel with more than one residence on it. Each one of those dwelling units would be assessed for fire protection assessment. Okay. The non-residential number they used was over 4 million square feet. It's caused a little controversy for me because I cannot determine how, where, why this information came from. I spoke with Brad just this morning about it as well. There's nothing in their study that indicates how this number was come to, but it is the number they use, so that's why it's kind of important to know. And then for the land, it was just over 300,000 acres. Little variance there. I don't know if something is transferred from one category to the other, but we have about 340,000 acres, and they had 311, so we got some variance there as well. So based on those things, which is going to be identifying our costs, knowing what percentage of each different type of property use was using the services.
On the go back, there you go.
There you go. Knowing what each property use percentage was using the services, and then knowing how many units of each were out there, the initial rates that they recommended to fund 100% of the costs was $191 residential per dwelling unit, 16 cents per square foot and 43 cents per acre.
How far off was their commercial? They said 4 million, how many do we really have?
Brad has a little under 3 in his system.
So they're off 25, 30%, right? And
Yes.
if they'd have used Brad's number, the per square foot would have been higher.
And it makes our buy down higher as well, because if you're thinking that the difference between what we can assess, what we can collect the assessment on is 2.3 million, and that 4 million number was accurate, then that makes your buy down much bigger.
Well, that 4 million number, you know what I mean? It said there's a lot more players to spread the cost out. If it was only 100,000 square feet, then it would be drastically higher than 16 cents a square foot.
Yes.
So that skewed it.
I think it's important to note too that they estimated that we would need $3 million a year,
Roughly, yes.
and now 8 years later, we're still spending half of that, 1.4.
Was capital and everything.
That was capital,
yeah.
and that was with each
But you're
individual
right, even-
VFD having a budget as well.
But even with capital, we're still not at 2 million.
Right, so if you cut that number in half, that gets pretty close to where our fire MSBU is now, the 191.
That's right.
I mean, I'm just doubting the inflated figure for the study, and I know
Yes,
we're
and-
not basing it on the study.
And I have some questions about some of the data as well. Like I said, I'm not sure, and there was nothing to indicate where some of these figures came from. But the methodology that they use is sound, and we have the correct figures now to follow this same methodology. And so we're going to go back and basically redo what they did with the correct numbers and the numbers that we can verify.
You've already done that.
Yeah.
We've already done that. And I even wrote the math out very simply behind the screen there.
And we can't rehash the past, and that was their study, but I remember sitting out in the audience and hearing words like Christmas tree, Christmas wish list.
Louis just said that.
Okay.
He just said that.
Yeah.
And you
so-
know, it's interesting, if you look at each of the individual budgets of the VFDs, they were very varied. So you can tell that you have some that are either active or that they're pushing to get all the money they can versus, you know, some of them that they had a budget of $7,000 a year. So
Yeah.
there was no consistency with the way those budgets were requested and appropriated to the different VFDs at the time.
Sounds very similar to like the impact fee study where, you know, assumptions are everything.
Oh, yeah.
Initial assumptions make the whole.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but there was even 2 boats in there on the original list at that time for the fire department to own 2 boats during this thing,
Yeah,
when they
there
had
was- there was
that Christmas
more-
wish list.
There was staff growth
Yeah.
put into that figure as well.
Yeah.
So we've been through how GSG and what information they used in order to calculate those preliminary rates. So now I think it's important to do a real good comparison on how we were operating then versus how we're operating now. So like we said, most of the service was provided by VFDs, and you had some that were more active than others, so you had different levels of service. At the time, we had about 150 volunteers, roughly half of them, or is that too high?
That's too high. Even back then, out of those 150, you were probably talking about 40 to 45 that were certified Florida firefighters.
But the remainder could go to the scene and do something, right? Or could they just stand around?
You gotta stay out of the hot zone, so really you're standing around until the scene's fully stabilized. I mean, they can roll hose.
And from an ISO standpoint, there's 0.
There are 0 that, yeah. And if they're not active, they hurt you on ISO, even if they're certified. So if they don't show up to training, they basically hurt your ISO, because when ISO comes in and assesses us on this, all of my firefighters, even the ones that show up to nothing, get counted, and then my hours are shared. Just like my response, all of my response to calls are shared. So if I've got 30 active people, but I got a roster of 100, for our hours, we don't even come close to meeting the training hours.
Now, why were there so many more, you know, it says there were 150. Were a lot of these like kids that just wanted to walk around with a walkie-talkie and feel like they were important?
When I first started here in '07, no, these were firefighters. I mean, these people were committed to the community, and And we still have some of those.
But you said there were, I'm sorry, there were 40 or something that were active. What about the other 90 is what I'm asking about? Who were they?
EMRs, emergency medical responders. Back then they were first responders. People that maybe didn't want to fight fire, but they wanted to help their
I
neighbor
got you.
out.
Okay, that answered your question.
And at this time too, we still only had 7 county employed staff for the fire protection. That was 1 fire chief and 6 firefighters, and then an on-call.
And that was 3 2-hour shift, 2 people to a shift for 3 shifts, right?
Correct. Yeah, 24, 48.
Because everything every 8-hour shift you got, it's like sheriff's department, you got to multiply it by 3 for it to be staffed 24 hours a day.
Ours, we just put, back then it was run 2 guys per shift. The chief was a 40-hour, just like myself, but it was 2 gentlemen on 1 engine, 24 hours a day, 365.
Oh, sorry.
That I just put a snapshot of the org chart in there. Go to the next one though.
I'm working. Whoop.
Oh, too far.
This thing has
Maybe you should give that thing to Brandy.
Maybe.
she couldn't do both.
Come on. So in 2010, we also had Wakulla participation, and they were active in everything from setting budgets, deciding what equipment would be assigned to which VFD, any operations that went on, they participated in a vote to make decisions. So they were much more active at that time. Each individual VFD had its own ISO rating assigned. So if you happen to be in the area with one of those VFDs with a negative score, it affected your individual rate for your insurance and things like that. There's the record keeping at the time was minimal at best and incomplete. Inventories of what equipment was where, who, staff, you name it, it was not as professional as we would like to see it.
Yeah, the major issue with the way it was run back then, and thank you to you guys for changing this year. What we've done now is we're operating as 1 fire department. Back then, it really was each department did their own thing. It was, you were lucky if you could get people to buy the same equipment. We, had a county fire chief in place, but Wakulla still had the power over him when it came to operational, because they would come in here and say how they wanted it to be, and that's how it went. So now it's everybody, we're doing all the same things, and we're slowly getting everything unified together. And the big issue, like she said too, is they kept their own records. They met with ISO on their own. The county fire chief wasn't involved with each individual department. And you guys know this, if it's not wrote down, it didn't happen. So the fact that they may have done a great job putting a fire out, that's awesome, but you didn't get credit for a lot of those.
Just a lot of overall inconsistency in the way service was being delivered and the way operations were being handled. So fast forward to where we are today, and Louis is operating as fire rescue. They are no longer just firefighters. These guys are all dual certified with the exception of 5 people on the EMS side. Every firefighter we have on staff is dual certified as either a paramedic or an EMT. So they're jumping in whatever truck they need to jump in, handling whatever kind of call they need to handle. So they're no longer operating in this segregated little buckets of, oh, we handle medical stuff over here, we handle fire. They're all in one. And in addition to that, he has assigned administrative functions to each one of the shifts in order to, there's a lot, they have a very complex world. They have a lot of equipment, they have a lot of facilities, they have a lot of things to keep track of, and so he's kind of set little pots, and each shift is in charge of a different type of activity, either fleet maintenance, facility maintenance, or supplies and logistics. So they're really operating in a totally different way than they were at the time in 2010. We now have a total of 48 county employed firefighters, but that is also the pool for his EMS staff as well. So this is the total pool for fire rescue. And of those, 30 are full-time, and the remainder are part-time or either flex on-call staff. Now, his staff, his non-administrative staff, works 48 hours on, 96 hours off. So if you're looking at that 48, and it seems like a lot when you consider that he's operating 24/7, he's got 3 shifts phasing out all the time. It's really not that much because there's 11.
There's 11, you have 11 staff on shift 24 hours a day, which is a roving battalion chief. One of them sitting in here right now, and they're an ALS equipped pickup truck, and they ride around jumping calls as help is needed. And then you have your 4 ambulances, 2 in Crawfordville, and then 1 in Medart, 1 in Wakulla Station, and an engine with 2 firefighters on it. Now, all of the ambulances have firefighters on them. Chief Morgan, when he was here, started this process. We've just pretty much finished it. We've made sure that each of the outlying stations have 2 firefighters where they used to run it with 1. It was a major safety concern of mine when I took over. I didn't like the fact that we were relying on 1 guy to do fire suppression on his own for up to 20 minutes, waiting on him help to get there. So, but yeah, it's really not that many when you think about the fact that we probably run on average about 20 calls minimum per shift. And each transport to Tallahassee, you gotta remember when 2 of my guys go out of Wakulla, it's an hour and 45 minutes is the average.
So of these 48 employees, I assume some of these are dedicated more to EMS than fire. Is that true? No?
I have 5 single cert employees left. I have 3 single cert paramedics. They're not firefighters, they're just paramedics.
Okay.
And I have 2 EMTs that are not fire certified.
So your employees, you've got 5 in addition to these 48.
That's sir. They're in that 48.
Okay. So
Everybody
how
else
many
is school certified.
EMS personnel do you have that are not part of this 48? I'm just trying to gauge the size between the fire and EMS side.
That's what if I could,
Got
you've got an
43.
engine with 2 guys on it.
Correct.
That's fire. That is, I know it's a fire EMS, but as far as being dedicated to fire, if you get a call, my house on fire, you got 1 engine and 2 guys to respond to it. Is that correct?
No, I apologize. We really need to quit looking at them as a truck, and we need to look at them more as a station. At each of those stations, like Medart and Wakulla Station, and even here in Crawfordville, where we have the 2 ambulances living right now, there are fire trucks at all those stations, and when the tones go out, they grab a fire truck. If it's a fire, if it's a medical call, they grab an ambulance. Usually we grab both. If we're going to fire, obviously we can bring an ambulance too, or a car wreck. You're going to get both. It's just like I said, it varies on the type of call.
So it's really hard to split out the cost of fire out of fire and EMS, then I'm assuming.
We did a lot of tracking. Brandy helped me with that and told me what I needed to do, to keep up with it, and I broke it out for her for 6 months, and it was. Then she worked the formulas, and
That's still a lot cheaper than having a dedicated people that only do fire, and then these people over here only do ambulance,
you're
which
getting
is
a
the way
lot
it's.
of bang for the buck.
Because the MSBU can offset some of the ambulance costs.
No.
Only when they're operating on the fire side.
No, and that's why we needed that information from him, is to see how much of their time they were spending doing each one of their functions, so we could come up with an allocation where we could separate a portion of their salaries to the general fund and a portion of their salaries to the MSBU fund. Things like medical supplies, they're automatic. That's EMS that goes to the general fund. Certain things that are used by both fire and EMS are split. Fire and EMS, office supplies, things like that. So we really look at each individual purchase or expense to analyze who's using it and decide where it needs to be charged to appropriately, so we don't charge anything to the MSBU that doesn't belong. And that goes right into the next thing. It's 62% of
I'm still
salaries.
unclear about one thing.
Okay.
Do you have a central purchasing?
It runs
The
through
individual-
Louis'
at
administration.
Individual stations. Mike can remember the water wagon for Obey Airport real well, probably. But, so, everything has to come through your approval, pretty much, is that correct?
We do all purchases.
And the purchasing? Yeah.
So these 48 employees, they're your dual qualified people. Is that right?
That's fine.
43 are dual,
43.
48 is the total pot for both fire and EMS.
Okay, that's what I was trying to get at. So if you had all your employees here, there'd be 48 people in the room, 43 of them dual qualified, and 5 that are working on just the EMS side. Okay.
And just so you're aware, we're no longer hiring any staff that are just single certified employees. And we'll eventually lose those 5 to retirement, things like that. Well, our volunteer count is down to 26 throughout the county that have met the required training, are actually responsive to fire incidents, and are certified through the state.
Are those comparable to the 40-something you were saying earlier in 2010? Are they more active, less active? Less?
It's still less active. It's just changed so much. I mean, business owners aren't inclined to let an employee go fight a fire in the middle of the day. They'd rather them stay at work and make us handle the problem. It's just not like it was when I started here, but it's not the department. It's nationwide. It's a huge, if you're in the fire service right now, you can find an article in any magazine about the decline of
It's just not
volunteers.
small town anymore.
Well, it used to be a necessity. Luther Anderson used to keep the fire truck at his house in Smith Creek, That's the only way they had fire protection. And, Smith Creek's still an outlier, but I think, now that people know that there is a full-time fire force, it's not as compelling, I guess, to volunteer because they know it's going to be taken care of. And a lot of people work in Tallahassee and they can't come down here. And
Well, and right off the bat, I mean, you're just to get your feet wet, it's 240 hours of training. And we provide that at no cost, and we provide equipment and everything, but 240 hours is a lot for somebody who's working 50, 60 hours a week already.
I think that was another great point that's changed over the years is the training requirements. Like
Yeah,
I said,
it was
Luther
40.
probably,
Was it 40?
40. it used to be
40.
Yeah,
I mean,
back when Othra was doing it, he may not have had to have any training.
Well, and also Louis is doing a good job of, one is making sure that there were the varying amounts of multiple people on multiple roles that shouldn't have been there. Also, training is a big part of this. Not only can we have firefighters, but they have to train with us. And that training, if you don't go to the required training, you can't make that list from an ISO standpoint. So that list was higher, but it has come down this year because Louis is making them go to training, and if they don't go to training, doesn't care whether they're a Class A fireman of the year for the state of Florida, they're not going to be counted.
Your budget is, you don't have a fire budget pretty much, or an EMS budget. They're combined under the MSBU.
Nope.
You do have individual budgets.
Yes.
This MSBU is suppression activities only.
What is your percentage of your fire budget as to the expenditures of the county?
Say that again, you lost me
Well,
there.
your percentage, what percentage of the county expenses does the fire budget require? What?
Of the total county budget?
Yes.
Well, it's about $75 million for the
All
total
right,
county
just do
budget.
the
It's
just
one.
do BOCC operational, I guess, maybe.
Well, there's about $21 million operational. So $1 million, right now it's $1 million, 1.4 of that.
Okay, to operate the fire department. What is that percentage as to the budget?
About, what's that?
10%.
10%?
Yeah.
EMS, what is that?
So just about the same thing.
So right now, fire and EMS are occupying about 10% each of the county budget.
Of the operational budget of the board only.
That's right.
The sheriff's department itself is
Yeah.
how much?
It's more about 6.5%.
The sheriff's department itself is like.
And then it's about 6.5% for fire. It's about probably 6.5% to 7% for EMS.
Oh, yeah.
And then, but you're right, and the sheriff is.
Sheriff's about 11 million, and so
They're over 50%.
over 50%.
So it's 6.5% then on both sides.
Mhm.
The other thing that's different here on our current structure is you guys approved the unification in May, and so now all the duties of the VFDs will transfer to the county, and one individual countywide ISO rating will be assigned, which is a very positive thing because we had several stations that were 10s.
We had from the representative from ISO's mouth, I had 4 that were going to go to 10s. I had 2 others that are probably, well, definitely are bigger homes in this county, coastal departments that were probably going to go to a 9 or a 10. After speaking with him, they were rated 5, so we were talking about people's homeowners insurance they were going to double.
So countywide, you'll have the same ISO?
Yes. If you're within 5 miles of one of our departments in the county, one of our stations, and within 1,000 feet of a hydrant, you'll get the same rating as somebody who lives right here in Crawfordville.
This was a very good thing.
Very good thing.
Yeah, that was 100%.
I'll ask a funny question. Does the hydrant have to be within 1,000 feet of the person's land or 1,000 feet of the house?
Well, that is a, yeah.
That's a darn good question.
It really depends,
Insurance agent.
I think
Yeah.
insurance companies are the land.
if you, well, yeah, it depends on who your insurance company is. I mean, we're always trying to
Depends on
help
whether
the
we want to
citizens.
insure you or not.
Do we have any idea what percentage of folks are not within 5 miles and not within 1,000 feet?
I could probably, that would be hard to gather, but I mean, I could work on gathering that, but no, at this time I don't.
We don't have a hydrant.
We don't, we have 3 different water providers in our county, and I am working on building that relationship right now.
Varying levels of where hydrants are or
You
not.
say either or? Either?
Both.
Both.
In ISO, you guys, ISO changed too, the way they're doing a rating, it's not, used to be well, anyways, it's an X now, if you're outside of it. But there are variances if there's other sources of water now, they'll give you a different level. So it's not just totally cut and dry, like if you're outside of that 1,000 feet, there's a mid-level. The other thing, I sent Chief Bowman and another one of my VCs to a high-level water supply training course up in Alabama where they do rural water supply, and we're implementing that training right now with our volunteers and career staff. Hopefully within next year I'm going to call ISO back and we're going to challenge it. And if we can show that we can produce X amount of gallons of water for 2 hours, then we're going to get a way better rate countywide. You may see people with a 5 that aren't within 1,000 feet of a hydrant.
Now, Louis, what about, we cover the majority with our VFDs. We cover we cover probably the majority of the county. We know we do that. Now, not all that area has a water supply system. What kind of rating do those folks get? They're within that 5-mile radius, but don't have a water source like a hydrant.
So like Smith Creek is a 5X. It's a substantial difference. I mean, it basically bumps them to almost like what a 10 would be.
But if they didn't have the VFD there,
they'd be non-recognized. There'd be no fire department. The VFD, having the fire truck sitting in the station does help. Having members that respond to calls does help. But and there's a huge difference between being unrecognized and a 10. Even a 10 is better, obviously, than being unrecognized. The other thing, even like out in Smith Creek, is it goes back to us proving that we can do this. Our volunteer chief out there, he's been working on getting us some what we call dry hydrants, which go into people's ponds and stuff as he can get permission. And that's another one of those, if we can show that we can get the water to a site, they'll come in and tell us an address, and they'll say, all right, give me 250 gallons per minute for the next 2 hours.
You usually have to do that? Can't just
These
do math.
guys, no, they actually make you flow it. I mean, they measure it and everything with meters.
Well, a pool wouldn't qualify, obviously, 250 gallons a minute for 2 hours.
No, we drain pool out with quickness.
So would you guess that half the people are not within 5 miles or within 1,000 feet or 25? I mean, I'm not going to hold you to it, but it just...
No, I think over half are because
Yeah.
your populace is so centered here around
Yeah.
Crawfordville, and we do have a decent hydrant system around here. So no, I would say over. I mean, really, it's your outlying
You're
areas.
rural, very rural.
Smith Creek.
Yeah.
Where I live. 1,000 feet is not...
Well, you've got a hydrant near you, right?
Nope, it's not as the crow flies, it's gotta be down the right of way.
Right.
So, no, if there was a hydrant in the Lonnie Raker Road, I could probably qualify, but it's, you gotta drive down a road, because they presented a map one time of the ratings. Sybil went and did it, and measured down each road, for the VFDs anyway, a certain, what was it, 5-mile radius or something?
Well, she did an arc, yeah,
Driving,
she did an
yeah,
arc.
driving miles.
It's the same thing with the hydrant. It can't just, I could see a hydrant across the field there, but I don't get credit for it.
Can't drag it to a house or through.
You can't, they go by the hoses. They're not gonna run the hose.
You may do that, but they won't give you credit for it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I don't have that credit at my house, the fire hydrant. Even though I can see one from my house.
Get cable in my house.
I can see the water tower.
There you go. This is a picture of our historical actual data for the revenue and expenses for the same period that ESG or GSG was projecting the cost of the budget. So we're looking at that same period. What's important on the revenue line is we had a rate increase of $5 and also a commercial and vacant land adjustment in 15-16. But you can see that it doesn't really, that was $5 to residential, doesn't really impact the revenue very significantly.
Commissioner Hess?
Yeah, previous slide, you didn't discuss the 68%.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry about that.
If you don't cover that, then
Yes, for our dual certified staff, 62% of their salaries and benefits, which would be also your FICA, your retirement, your health insurance, and their actual hourly wages, 62% of that is billed directly to the general fund, and then that remaining 38 is charged to the MSBU fund. Based on the time diary studies that they performed, it's closer to 50-50, but for one, we want to err on the side of caution here, so we're not inappropriately charging something to the MSBU. And second of all, the revenue wasn't there to support the 50-50 split of these guys being charged there.
In an ideal world, you would have the MSBU supporting all of it?
You legally can't do that.
Not with their dual certification, because they are functioning as EMTs and paramedics when it's
I
required.
got you.
So if you'd assume 50%, the proposed MSBU today would be higher, obviously.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
you're only taking 38% of the personnel costs to justify the MSBU that you say we need to have.
Yes, and we definitely want to be conservative with that number, just because we don't want to get into a situation where we're inappropriately using MSBU funds for things they shouldn't be. So,
Sued over that one time.
yes, we don't want to go back down there. Okay, so we talked about the revenue and that we had a $5 increase in our residential. It's not significant amount of additional revenue. And then these are actually our expenses for the last 6 years. So we are spending 15-16, spent about $1.3 million. We took all the capital out in the middle of 14-15 in order to make sure we had enough revenue to pay for the salaries that do belong there and their regular operations and the maintenance of the fleet. And so that 14-15 one is when we identified that the capital had to be paid from 1 cent sales tax. You've got some,
Is the capital still being paid by the 1 cent?
yes it is. And what we're talking about here, when we get to the budget portion, this is just continuing to fund operations. This is not bringing capital back in.
So I got a question about that. And I like the way you broke down the historical perspective to try to figure out how we got here. Based on this chart right here, I went through and I saw on your revenue side, we have an average increase of about 3.6% per year when we look at all years. But our expense averages 9.8%. So our expense is growing 3 times faster than our revenue. And that doesn't account for the fact that we pulled the capital expenditures out of there, or that number would be even higher.
Right.
And so, keeping in with the historical, how hard would it be to compare that simple revenue and expense trend line with, say, EMS and the Sheriff's Department, so we can get a gauge for whether or not we're keeping in pace with revenue and expenses with other public safety areas?
Well,
Not now. I'm not saying
Yeah.
do give it.
Oh, okay.
Well, one of the
Now.
problems that you have with this fund without increasing the per unit cost is just like with our $80 on a commercial side that we've got now. 100 homes, that's $8,000. And that's in our, right now, our every year, our insurance goes up, what's that, about $10,000 a year?
Yes.
Just to cover general liability.
Yeah, that's not
So
even
automatically, the problem is growth, unless we really do this in growth, it can't keep up with like the sheriff's department. We give the sheriff's department every year a 2%, which is about, between about $250,000 a year. This has never gotten that $250,000 a year pop, if that's, what I mean, that we're asking for. And like in the MSBU, not the MSBU, the revenue in the EMS fund has went up. But what we've done is over the years, we said we're going to keep the same percentage loss, try to stay within a couple of percentage loss of our revenue. Meaning, if we can handle $1 million loss this year, the past 3 years, we can handle it moving forward. So as our county grows, we can add people, but so will our revenue. We're going to try to keep it at that $1 million loss.
Percentage-wise.
Percentage-wise, that's right.
To follow up with Ralph, for example, from 12-13 to coming budget year, it goes up $220,000 in personnel costs. What is that?
Well, as we talked about that in 10-11, you only had 6 county employed staff and a fire chief. As we've started to develop, they have reallocated and added additional staff and moved into the dual certification program. The minimum starting pay for a dual certified employee is higher than a single certified employee. So there's been a lot of operational and personnel changes that have factored in there. We're in the new normal now.
Mm-hmm.
And so we know where we're going to be now. We've got the allocation to the general fund, we've got our staff split appropriately, and we're fully staffed for our current size.
That's what it's kind of hard, I guess, to reconcile. We could go back to 10-11 and say we had 6 people.
6 people.
But now there's no way to really say we have 7 people because everybody's dual, unless you broke out what hours they spend on what. It sounds like 30% is fire-related activities, roughly. So out of 48 people.
30%.
38%.
That's what I was about to do.
And that's administrative and calls.
So of 48 people, 38% of that is 18.24 FTEs.
All right, you said that the cost is 6.5%
Yep.
of expenses. What is that same thing as to revenue? What is our cost
One thing
of
that's changed
providing
volunteers.
fire and EMS as a percentage of revenue?
I'm not sure I'm following your
Well,
question.
If you have so much county revenue coming in, what is the cost percentage-wise of the fire and EMS? If you have $1 million of revenue coming into the county, and your fire and EMS is $1 million, if you have $100 million and it's 1 million or 10 million, it's 10%. So what is a percentage of your fire and EMS expense as to the total revenue?
The fire and EMS expense added together is just under $4 million for 17-18.
And the total revenue is what?
And each one of those has $1 million each
2.8.
in revenue.
Yeah, so 2.8. Oh, that includes that's our new rate.
Scott, is the
It's a pretty easy.
has the decline in volunteers
Scott?
affected your need? Not Scott, Louis.
Whoa.
Just retired though. Got another job.
It's going to be about
Louis.
$2.2 million in revenue, and it costs about $3.8 million in expense.
I got EMS and emergency management mixed up there.
What is our total county revenue?
Oh, for the general fund?
Yeah, that's what we're paying it out
I
of?
think we're back to its original.
No, and
Paying a portion of it from the general fund, and we're paying a portion of it from
I'm just trying to
SBU.
find what is our
10%,
expense of
Jerry.
fire and EMS as to our total revenue.
20% for both 10% for each is what she said a while ago.
Okay.
It's the same
Yeah.
question, a different way.
Well, he said
Same numbers though.
It's 6.5, that's what he said, it's 6.5.
13%.
of one
13%
figure and
for-
10% of the other.
Lou, how has the,
Percent of gross.
It's,
has the loss of volunteers affected how many people you've needed to fight fires?
Yes.
Okay, so a few years ago, you may have had a bunch of volunteers that could show up to fight the fire. You wouldn't have needed so many people.
how are they changing?
But now, to maintain the current level of service we have today, is there any way to go back and get more volunteers so we won't have to spend as much money on personnel?
I will tell you this, we're actively trying to get more volunteers and get them trained up. We're trying to get the ones we have to train and come to calls. The ugly truth of it, most of your fires in this county are being answered by career staff.
Randy, I don't think in this world that we're living in and where we are here today that you're going to get people who are interested in, like they were in the old days, the volunteer.
Well,
It's just not going to happen.
That's
too busy.
exactly the point I was trying to get to, is a lot of people are gonna say, well, why has that gone from 394 to 744 from 10 to today? And part of that answer is because you used to have a bunch of volunteers, the regulations weren't so tight, they could show up to fight the fire, so you didn't have to have the career guys to do it. But those days are over. There's either you have the career guys in there, or you just don't respond to the fire.
Yeah. And this gentleman, this is Chief Bowman, you guys, he runs the calls, he runs my incident scenes for me. Out of those 26 that we even have, would you say about 13 are countywide, they're hardcore volunteers. These guys come out day or night.
The Darcy guys.
Yes, guys like that they're there.
If we had 100 Darcys, we may not even need 3 shifts. You know, it'd be a lot cheaper. That's the honest truth.
Panacea guy.
That's the honest truth. We wouldn't need a big fire service if we had.
Once they got television, Randy, they were not bored anymore.
Exactly.
So before television, they were looking for a way to get out of the house. Fire was a good way.
That's one reason costs have gone up. Can you think of any other why?
Yes, well, it's from when I've been in this county, which I started here in '07, in July of '07. One of the challenges we had when we first took over is that, honestly, there wasn't any kind of fleet maintenance. Facilities maintenance was done by just people when they had time to go do it. The volunteers were working on their own truck, so which is nasty liability you don't want on the county. The expense has gone up. I mean, we have aging buildings, we have aging trucks.
That's not personnel costs. I mean, I understand the operating costs going up because you got to get things recertified. Now they're being maintained a little better.
Bunker gear. It costs us about $3,500 to outfit a firefighter. That's gone up a
Yeah.
lot. It probably used to be $800. Just the operating has gone up.
But your big jump in your salaries, if I'm not mistaken, is what he's trying to say, is that personnel line is primarily due to the allocation. We've got a correct allocation now. And before, that allocation was we had no confidence in it. And that's the reason we had to get that set. And now that we've got that set and everybody agrees to that, that's that number now.
The personnel cost has averaged 14.2% year over year,
Yeah.
where our revenue is going up 3.6.
Mhm.
And that's where I was trying
I
to
apologize,
get to.
yeah. Well, and there was no allocation before. We paid for 6
Ralph, what's going-
full-time
what's gonna
employee
change?
firefighters. And then EMS,
Is that gonna
your
change
3
that?
ambulances were funded out of the general fund.
Has on the EMS side,
Throw more revenue.
has their
Control costs.
cost been
I like the last.
lowered or whatever?
On
In
the
other words,
EMS?
if you were to go back and separate back from the old days in 10, 11, what did it cost to run a fire and an EMS? And today, your fire rescue, is it less today than it was then?
It's more, but you're asking to compare apples and oranges. You're a fire rescue department now, so you have these guys who are dual certified. Basically, what I've done is instead of coming to you and asking you guys for 21 firefighters, and I still need my 9 EMS or 10 EMS employees, where I'd have more full-time, I'd have 30-something guys per shift. You're getting more bang for the buck by having these dual certified people who are there to split the job.
I'm just trying to boil it down into something I can explain to a member of my family, for example, if you take the old fire department and add on the old ambulance department, is that number higher or lower than the total fire rescue budget today?
I'll tell you in just a minute.
And while she's doing that, I can tell you it's going to probably be lower because your starting pay rates were
I
less when
think
you
it'd be
were.
better to do it like on a per capita basis, based on population. you
Well,
know?
also look at, but the advantage of the new system is that our ISO rating is.
Oh, I understand. You don't need
And
to
so-
convince me. I'm just trying to, the numbers.
And
you know.
so that when you start talking about, when you start telling your public about this, you've got to, they've got to understand that if we don't do this, our ISO rating could get really high, and that'll stop,
Oh, you
raise
know
their
what? I've already
insurance
got this
and
because I did
stop
that worksheet that
development in the county.
combines.
And so.
I knew I'd need that.
Okay.
You don't need to convince me, Chuck.
The problem.
Yeah, 10, 11.
Louis, the problem I have is,
Separate.
and I know you understand this, is like Ralph just said, is we can't continue to let the cost of personnel and all this other outpace the income. We can fix it today or whenever we fix it and make the new amount, which I'm for. But we can't continue to let this one keep rising faster than what we got
That's what I
coming
was
in.
trying to say, Mike, whereas that everything follows. If-
I know.
If this
But-
goes up.
I know, but going forward, we gotta somehow.
Well, and that's
manage
what
that.
we're gonna, as part of the proposal, we're also, going to, just like we do in our wastewater fund, we're gonna ask you guys for as part of this, a 2%, or a CPI increase each
Right on.
year.
Understand.
Because it just, your pure, it doesn't have an infusion of cash from anywhere else.
I agree.
It has to be paid for by that, so,
I agree, but if we're gonna use.
right.
just
But yes,
understand
you're
that-
right. If we got to live within that, that gives us
Exactly.
our ability.
Especially if we're gonna use the 1 cent sales tax to pay for equipment, then we owe it to the citizen to say, we're gonna do our best to stay within our means.
That's
here.
right.
And
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
fine with a CPI increase. We just gotta, I don't wanna have to come back here year after year and try to put another Band-Aid on it.
Cool.
Let's fix it, try to let it manage itself, and the CPI should manage that little increase we need.
That's right.
What is your shortfall now, today?
That's in a later slide.
Yeah, let's get to that slide. We'll get to that slide
I'll
just
tell you
one
what,
second.
Mike, if this is what you're saying, is you're not asking for, you're saying you need a 19% increase to stop bleeding off the general fund.
$19.
Right.
Well, it's 19%. If you look at $80 to $99, it's a 19% increase. You're not going to come back next year, the year after, and say, now now it needs to be 102, now it needs to be 105, or,
And we're gonna fix that with the CPI, I understand. It's just, we gotta explain this to Joe Citizen and they want fire protection. I've talked to them, and they're okay with that. And, but we can't let that keep running up here and this just lagging behind, and then we're back here again trying to fix it.
No, I agree 100%, and I mean, like Mr. Herbert says, I think this gets it, we're gonna get it fixed, but one of the challenges too for Joe Citizen to understand is what we're providing here is a better service.
Right.
Their insurance, I had a gentleman come in my office the other day that had one insurance company drop him completely, and he lives in the Gardens. They dropped him, and the other one, it was double what it started at, because he's outside the realm. Part of what I'm trying to build is I'm trying to cover these areas and provide a better service and get this ISO rating where it belongs for all of our citizens. And we're operating tight. We're not making frivolous purchases. We're not fixing things that don't need to be fixed. We're actually trying to reduce our fleet size. This is, to me, we're fixing something that was wrong
All
a
along.
long time ago. I mean, my first time as chief, I didn't know near what I know now, but even back then, it wasn't there. It wasn't where it needed to be. It wasn't even close.
No, I agree. I think there should have been a CPI in place years ago where they had been keeping pace with this, and then we wouldn't be here today trying to make a big increase.
My only problem with that, though, if we go back to 10 and 11, we had a $713,000 fund balance. And then based on that chart, we can show that we've averaged a 3.6 increase. And so our CPI has been less than 3.6 since 2011, so, or 1011, so I don't know how to really sell that as that's the fix, when if that's the fix, then it seems like we shouldn't be in the fix that we're in now, because we've outpaced the CPI, and now we don't have that $700,000 fund balance that we had in 10-11.
But didn't we use that, in their defense, didn't we use that 700-something thousand to buy equipment? Didn't we buy major equipment
Some,
purchases?
up until 13, 14, yes.
Right.
Ralph, if you look from 11, 12 to 14,
Yeah, you-
15, it goes up $27,000. That's less than 3% a year.
Yeah, but from 10, 11, 11, 12, it went up 13%.
Yeah,
11
That's because of
Big
the
Probably a rate
one-time hit.
increase.
Well,
Yeah.
the big increase is 14, 15, 15,
Well,
16.
Going across the top, it's up 13, up 1, down 1, up 2, up 7. And so average that out over those 5 years, that average is 3.6.
Yeah, but wasn't there a rate increase in there somewhere?
The two rate increases.
It's gonna, you know,
Right.
if, I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
But if the rate had been the same the whole way, it wouldn't, you're averaging over 5 years. I would look more at 11, 12 to 14, 15. What is that increase? That's probably more like 1 or 2%.
11, 12, actually it's 0. It went up 1 year, down 1 year, so I mean, it's right about, I mean, not exactly 0, but a slight positive.
I think that rate
Less than
increase
one.
is skewing
Yeah.
the average.
The rate increase does skew that, because that's what we're saying, is this fund just, growth can't keep up with it. That's just all there is to it.
And let me point out something about your personnel expense in 15, 16. That's when Chief Morgan resigned, and so we had to pay him for about 6 months while we were also paying the new fire chief. So you have some overlap there that's got your personnel inflated.
I came on in 210, and this system was just about as big a mess as you could absolutely ever. Nobody was talking, the whole county was the same way. Nobody was talking to anybody. We had 16 different departments. Nobody was talking. And today, I congratulate you, Louis. This fire system is well organized and well run, and I never hear any complaints. There's no complaining. I don't hear complaints out of your fire people. That's where we used to get all the complaints, not from the citizens, but all the fire people. They were just not happy, so.
It looks like 11, 12 to 14, 15, it was $61 a unit through that whole time, right? It didn't get changed again until 14.
Yeah, the $75. Yes.
It got changed in 14 to 75, but before that, so that number was $61 from that time period. So I think that's a realistic way to say, here's how much new growth has generated an increase in revenue, which it's basically flat, you know, if you average those 4 years. Then it went up to $75, so it jumped up $100,000 basically, right? Going from 61 to 75. I don't know if that was full year of revenue, but
Well, and then from 14, 15 to 15, 16, that's when you went from 75 to 80.
yeah, but it didn't kick in until, okay.
We start October 1st. That's the collection for that year.
But whether you had additional people paying into it, or we had a rate increase, it still averaged 3.6. It still outpaced inflation, outpaced the CPI. And so the CPI alone would not have fixed this problem, because in 10, 11, we had $713,000 in fund balance there. You know?
I got you.
All right.
David, let me ask you a question.
Yes, sir.
This is sort of technical question. What is the difference between an assessment and a fee and a tax?
A fee this is a fee from the standpoint of, this is a service that's provided to our citizens.
That's a fee.
That's a fee. This is it's direct, it's every bit of they pay, every dollar they pay goes towards that service, paying for that service, just like a solid waste pro.
Municipal service benefit unit.
That's right, it's a benefit unit, so it goes straight to that. That's a waste, it's a solid waste fee, it's a MSBU fee.
I can actually, it's actually.
And anyway, that's a simple guy, she's going to give you a complicated one.
This is actually a non-ad valorem assessment. It's collected on the tax bill, and there's constitutional provisions that allow it to be enforced against homestead property. So this is a special assessment. A fee is something like a user fee, where you go and pay to launch a boat.
So a fee is like a big ounce per dock.
Yep.
That's a fee.
And a tax is something everyone pays. There's no benefit requirement. You pay it as a burden of living in a civilized society.
And with an assessment there,
Truly, I mean, that's the legal requirements. There's no, you pay school board taxes and you may not have a kid in school, so you pay it anyway.
I like
The
that.
closest analogy I can come for this MSBU is the garbage. You pay $196 a year, the service you get is your garbage picked up at your house, right? So we have opted correctly, I think, to say the garbage service, we're going to charge the citizen whatever it costs to provide that service, all right? And I think we should do the same with fire. Here's what it costs for garbage, that's what you pay. Here's what it costs for fire, here's what you pay. And, you know, hopefully I'll never have to use the fire service. But, you know, Waterloo was glad it was there when Kevin's shop caught on fire. It probably saved the Ace Hardware. A lot of people that get in that. And another analogy I come up with is, you know, why should we be paying this much for it? We're probably never going to use it. Well, why does anybody have health insurance then? You know, we don't need it right now, so why waste your money on it? You know, it's basically an insurance. If something ever does, good Lord, I don't know how much I pay Farm Bureau every year for homeowners insurance. I'll probably never need it, but you got to have it. And this is, to me, this is fire insurance. You know, if my house catches on fire, I know. Heck, I can't even start a fire at my front yard and burn logs up. These guys showed up, would put it out
we
for me.
consider this an assessment.
Yes.
Yes, I'm sorry, I misspoke on the fee thing.
Anyway, that's the best analogy I could think of. Is this is like garbage. This is the service
All right.
you get. This is what it
I'll
costs.
move forward. We were worried about turning up.
Not
$2.
having, yeah, I wasn't. All right, that's just a little visual aid there to show how much more we've spent than we've collected since 10/11. So at the end of 13/14, the MSBU had almost $500,000 in fund balance. At the end of the current year, and I've revised this in your tentative budget because they're looking a little better because we're getting close to the end of the year, they may have about $20,000 left, but that's it. That's all of their fund balance. We brought forward $170,000 in the current fiscal year in order to balance the budget and provide the cash. It's paying for recurring expenses, and we know...
What did you say you brought forward? Where did you bring it forward?
From the MSBU fund balance. They started 16-17 with $170,000 cash left in their fund balance.
Their reserve.
We brought that whole entire amount forward in the current fiscal year in order to cover the budget. There was not, and then we also transferred $130,000 from the general fund to make up the shortfall.
Okay.
So that's
So-
what's the current fiscal year.
If we were to do this, whatever, then basically we can go down year by year by year and not be talking about what we're talking about today.
Right. That's the idea. And also to get off the general fund year over year over year, giving a bigger and bigger and bigger contribution to the MSBU fund to support its operations.
Will the general fund be capped then as to how much it will contribute?
That'll depend on you. You guys have to approve a rate each year, and like we talked about, we intend on reevaluating this each year based on who's using the service. So you could have potentially that if the commercial use starts to go up, your residential rate comes down, and then apply a CPI. So this has got to be approved each year.
I'm talking about basically if I said, well, I'm just not going to give you anything out of the general fund.
Well, this assumes after,
This fixes that.
this fixes that, what you're talking about.
Yes.
This fixes it to where in the future, if we run this right, just like we do every other fund, is it should not, every fund should maintain itself, and that's what this does. This sets its fund up to maintain itself.
Just to jump ahead to Brandy's key.
Operate like it's operating on its, it'll be able to operate on its own expenses and revenues.
Go ahead and hit that. What does this do?
Oh, you're getting ahead of me here.
Yeah, just hold on. She's got her mythology.
So in a 3-year period, basically they burned through almost $500,000 in fund balance. Now we talk about the support from the other funds, the general funds, and the 1 cent sales tax. So over almost $8,000 of capital equipment has been purchased for the fire department since 14-15 from 1 cent sales tax, and we did spend a little bit of impact fees as well. And in addition to that, we've got this salary allocation. We are not putting all those salaries on there, so we're supplementing the personnel with general fund dollars. So we have been covering that buy down that we talked about, which we have to cover, but we've been covering that and more. And in addition, I think we talked to y'all about the cost allocation study that we had performed. And this tells us for each individual fund how much the administrative costs to operate the fund, and that's to process payroll for the employees, to cut checks, and all the things that go with it. And so that study revealed that it's about $140,000 in administrative costs to run the MSBU fund. We've been taking 40 and transferring it to the general fund for the since 10-11. So we've been supplementing that $100,000 for those administrative costs. So we've more than covered that buy down with contributions from other funds.
So you will basically quit that funny money stuff?
No.
Gary can always put it.
No, because
Clear,
that
easy
is
to
what it
understand.
costs. The general fund is handling all those obligations.
You will be taking that money that we're talking about out of the new
Yes,
assessment.
it's included as one of the
David-
costs.
Serious money,
David
not the
isn't
funny
having
money.
funny money. No, you're the person who runs the funny money.
Oh, no. It's legitimate cost of operations. Let's see, I think we talked about that
Print the funny money, please.
that our allocation is conservative, just to make sure that we're not inappropriately charging. And then the last point here is that in this current year, you're not on the right side.
I got you.
Okay.
I was getting
In
a
the
drink of water.
current year, the general fund transferred an additional $130,000 on top of the $170,000 of cash that we brought forward. We had to make up another $130 from the general fund to cover the shortage in revenue. So at the very least, go ahead, Commissioner Thomas.
Well, go ahead and finish.
For 17-18, and this kind of depends on whatever final rates get approved, but at the very least, we're going to have to transfer another $200,000 from the general fund.
So I tried following some of that this afternoon, and it was after we met today, so I apologize. I haven't had a chance to help you get me back on track here. But if you can, I'll explain it to you, and then we can look at it closer later. I looked at the 14-15 budget.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and on that budget, we were showing a projected ending fund balance of $687,054.
Mm-hmm.
Then I went to the 15-16 budget, looking back at 14-15. So I'm staying with that 14-15 year throughout this whole thing. And instead of 687,054, it looks like we ended up with a fund balance of $538,000. That's $150,000 less than we budgeted. But then this is where it got confusing. Then I went to the 16-17 budget, still looking at 14-15, and it's showing an ending fund balance of $389,000. So between these 3 years, we've lost $300,000 that I can't account for. Now, the closest that I came to accounting for it is in the 15-16 budget, there's $296,761 in cash forward, but then that's missing in the 16-17 budget.
Your numbers are not matching up to what I have in my worksheet.
I printed these off the website today, off the
Okay.
county website today.
Okay, I'll have to look at that because I could put this on a flash drive if you want, but I don't have one.
Yeah,
with me.
go ahead.
And I just wanted to bring it to your attention, and I'll summarize all that and shoot it to you so you can
Okay.
follow. And if I'm off track, but I mean, you see where I highlighted here. It's showing $296,000 in cash forward.
And
over
see,
the
and
very
I'm
next
showing
year-
that amount in 14-15 was the amount of cash forward was to 296.
But then if you look at the 16-17 budget, that cash forward is missing.
Are you in the actual column or are you in the final budget column?
I'm in the actual.
And it won't,
It won't, in the
it
actual.
won't show in your actual column because it's part of your budget. It's budget only. You have to bring it forward to balance your budget and to fund everything, but you won't actually,
But this was 2 years later, I mean, a year later. So why wouldn't it, if that's accurate for 15, 16, why wouldn't those numbers stay accurate for 16, 17?
I'm not sure, and we'll look at that because I want to make sure what's out there is correct, because it's not quite matching up to the years that I have those dollar amounts.
Because even the fund balance, you know, it dropped down to 389,000, where the prior year had 14, 15 as 538. So if we had an extra
But I don't even have that number.
$150,000 sitting in that fund balance, we'd be having a different conversation today.
Yeah, and I don't even have that 538 number. My ending fund balance for 14-15 was 389, 539, which would in turn be your beginning fund balance for 15-16.
Yeah.
So-
I see the 389, 539 on the 16, 17 budget, but I don't know. It just-
Okay. Well, we
Then,
didn't-
well, and if you
Here.
follow that, the next year you lost $218,790, which brought that 389, 539 down to 170.
170.
So, all right, then the next year, you actually profited $272,000, so if fund balance went back up to 443.
Right. It's just from year to year, I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong, but whatever we ended up with in 14, 15 should, 14, 15 should translate on the 15, 16 budget and the 16, 17 budget. That number should match. It shouldn't change from year to year.
Well-
Because we're already a year and 2 years down the road.
Are you talking about the fund balance policy number, or are you talking about what the cash available is?
Ending, the fund balance ending.
Okay, so,
Well, it does, but it goes to actual, the 389
I'll
flows
give
to
you this
15,
copy.
16. Maybe I don't understand what you're talking about.
I don't understand it either. So this is 14, 15. It's showing 687 is the tentative
okay,
budget.
and that's why, because you don't have an entire year right here in 13-14.
Now, I'm here, I'm in this column.
Right, but this year not being complete affects this number, because you're not actually going to have this profit
Okay.
of 258.
So, and that makes sense of why this would be $150,000
Yes,
less.
yes.
That makes sense to me. I'm with you on that. But then, this is 15, 16, and it's the 14, 15 column, and then that number changed, same 14, 15 column, but on the 16, 17 budget, now it went from 538 to 389, and this cash forward is missing.
Yeah, that's because this is an actual number. Your cash forward is a budgeted number. It's what you need to fill in the gap between the revenue and the expense.
And you don't,
But
you
the
show it
revenue went
in,
down too, so it shows 1.3 million in revenue.
Because
This
this
is the
is your
next year.
actual, it's not this is your budget column, and we know what budgets are. This is our capacity here. And then this is what actually happens. So the way we're spending this cash,
Well, this is 13, 14, this is 14, 15.
right,
That's right,
right.
exactly.
The way we're spending our cash is because this is what it actually cost us right here. So, and this is not a full year. So you have, I can't even read what that says. That's through August. So you don't know how your year ends up.
Well,
But
that
I
one
can tell
is,
you,
but this is final. This says through August, this says final,
this
so-
is your final budget, not your final actual.
okay? So, we went from 687 to 538 to 389.
Right.
So, I mean, either way, there's a $300,000 difference there between budget and the 2 years.
I might have to start printing this differently. I have it a little different now where it's blacked out, so it's not so
Yeah.
confusing, but
Okay.
it's because you don't have the total year of actual expenses in there. So until you get everything in for the whole year, you won't know exactly where you're gonna end up.
But what point is that? Because, I mean,
You won't like the answer. It's
What?
not until December.
well, I know that, but when we're doing our 15, 16 budget,
Mhm.
that was done in, September? That was like 2 weeks left in the year.
Right.
So we should have a pretty good handle of what happened at where the number for 14-15 was going to end up.
Pretty good, but you're only going to have,
$150,000 difference between the 2 weeks and then a year later.
you're only going to have through, if you're lucky, through August financials at the point that you approve the final budget.
Right.
And they still post expenses to the prior fiscal year up until November.
Okay.
So all through October and November, you have 60 days after the fiscal year ends to accrue expenses back. And things like P-card charges, they are on a monthly statement that we don't get, for a couple weeks after. They're still accruing expenses. So what you are going to have is the majority of your personnel.
Mm-hmm.
You're only going to have maybe 2 paychecks and then an accrual from the paycheck that overlaps the last week of the fiscal year. But you're still going to have operating expenses being accrued there up until November 30th.
I understand that.
So
It's just-
and it's actually, like I said, I think it was January of this year before we had final expenses for the previous fiscal year. And there's, because there's journal entries they're still doing, there's a lot of things to get the year closed out. And some of it takes a little longer than we'd like.
And on a $1.3 million budget, I don't believe that we missed our budget number by $300,000.
No.
But that's what these numbers are showing me.
Right.
That we missed it by 300,000, and I don't believe that. I just don't understand how this is tracking. But if we missed it by 300,000, we need to tighten up our budgeting process. But I know that's not what I'm accusing. I'm just trying to figure out how it's so far off for 3 different years.
About the only thing that happens in real time on your financial statement is your personnel expenses, and that's just basically your hourly wages. Even your FRS stuff is a month behind, and all of your operating is a month, 2 months behind.
Power bills.
Because
yeah.
it's how quick the invoices come in, how quick they get processed, how quick I review them and send them to the clerk's office. So you have a definite lag in your operating expenses.
Mm-hmm. Very good. I'll get with you on it.
Okay. All right, back to so for 17-18, depending on what rates get approved, we're going to need to transfer at least $200,000 from the general fund. Now, based on our current rate structure, where we are, which is the $80 per residential dwelling unit, less than 6.5 per square foot, and 18 cents an acre for land, we're estimating that to generate about $1.1 million.
Does the state's new deal on land change that 18 cents?
It doesn't change the rate that we assess. It just changes the units available for assessment. So we had a bunch of acres that are now exempt from us being able to collect that revenue on.
So you're assuming the same revenues you got this year?
I'm not assuming that in my budget. I'm just telling you that based on that rate, that's what we would collect. Now,
Go hold with me.
we got to give him some clicker training.
All right, there we go. I need quick training.
And in contrast to that, our proposed preliminary budget is almost $1.7 million. Now, the caveat here is that does include a reserve, so our real operating expense is just under $1.5 million, and you can see how this all breaks down: personnel, operating, equipment. We do still buy small equipment from the MSBU fund, and this is going to be like chainsaws and generators, those type of things, and they do buy some of the breathing apparatus as well from the MSBU fund. Our
Balls of life. Sorry, Louis, I had to bring that up.
extrication equipment. And also, we have our administrative costs here that we just talked about, that $143,000 from our cost allocation study. And then that reserve is the $189,000 that we intend to hold back to prop up that fund balance. So even though it's in your total budget, it's not a expense, it's what you hope to save back at the end of the year. So everything, each different type of expense added together is how you get to your 1.6. And that was turned over to you on Friday. That's included. That's my preliminary budget for the MSBU fund. I might have adjusted it a little bit because I think, like I said, they're going to have about maybe $20,000 cash at the end of the year. At this point, each time that I get a new financial statement, I update what my projections are going to be for where we're going to end the year, and so
What is that administrative part? Is that
that's...
taking over the transfer part? Are you up in the
That's
allocation?
what it is. It is a transfer, but I put it in there as administrative cost, so
So the allocation is going from 40 to 89?
yes. And based on the information that we provided, a lot of data to a consultant to run those numbers, and it's actually impacted the building fund, the MSBU fund. We did have some funds actually go down, which is solid waste. We were taking a little bit more from the solid waste, but there was no method to how we were doing it. We just said, okay, let's take 50,000 from this one. Now we have a method to actually understand what it costs us for administration of all these different funds. David's got the right slide up there now, and this is talking about the impact of the growth. You can see that it's not significant. 100 new homes, which is about the rate that we're putting on, maybe a little more, but 100 new homes at our current rate is $8,000 a year. A building equivalent to Walmart is an additional $11,000. And we do have some commercial picking up, and I don't think we have had the equivalent of a Walmart quite yet, but it's not significant in the amount of new revenue just based on our growth. And on the flip side of that, on our expenses, just our property and general liability insurance, they go up about $10,000 to $11,000 a year. So that growth is not keeping pace with your utilities, and you know, we still have 11 stations that we keep: internet, phone, utilities, water, sewer, whatever. So those go up each year. So it's just not keeping pace with the expenses. So now we get to the fun part. These are the proposed assessment rates for 17-18, and we know that the preliminary rate resolution is on the regular meeting agenda. So it's going to be $99 per dwelling unit, less than 12 cents per square foot for non-residential, and little less than 22 cents per acre for land.
It's not
And
agricultural.
not agricultural.
Pine trees won't be...
And so at those rates, that's the revenue that we're going to generate, a little
Now-
less than 1.5.
Do y'all want to see how she got at those rates? We wrote it up on the board behind that.
Why don't you finish the thing, and if
Okay.
you got enough time, then fine.
Okay,
Okay.
okay.
I got a couple of questions too. And I apologize, you might have covered it, and I'm trying to follow, and I might have missed it. Tell me what on your proposed 17-18 budget, what's the interfund transfer and the reserve?
The interfund transfer is going to be $143,745.
And where does that go?
It goes to the general fund, because the general fund does all the administration for the MSBU.
Which goes to the clerk of court.
Clerk's office, and
So
then...
the MSBU revenue is paying the general fund for that portion. You're paying it out of,
Well, actually, right now, we're transferring more revenue back in than what we're taking, but we still want to identify that is a cost to the MSBU fund. So we're transferring that out, and then we're supplementing it with $200,000 or whatever we're going to need to supplement it with.
Yes. What that means is, what they're saying, that study would say, is to run the MSBU, is from administrative, is going to be about $117,000 is the share of the MSBU
Right?
to the general fund.
so interfund's going to general fund. What about the reserve, 229,000?
That is going to stay, it's going to go directly to fund balance at the end of the year to prop up the MSBU fund balance, since they're completely depleted of cash. I mean, I'd call $20,000 on a...
Stays in the MSBU fund balance.
Stays in the MSBU
All that stays in
fund.
MSBU.
And that's the purpose of
The only
us
thing that comes
supplementing.
out is that interfund transfer.
Okay.
That's basically overhead.
What?
Overhead, interfund
Interfund
transfer.
Yeah, it's just
transfer.
overhead. It's the cost of doing business, that's right.
Where were we? Okay, there we are. This chart up there breaks down the rate and how much each different property use type revenue will generate at the proposed rates. Now, this is all in. This includes are all units. So we're going to go through and we're going to apply our exemptions, and we're going to have a lower number of what we actually collect. But we have to consider all these units when we come up with our assessment, like we talked about. The difference between that is our buy down, and it's about $231,000 based on my preliminary budget for 17-18. So once we apply those exemptions, you can see the difference. So we're going to collect that little less than $1.5 million, and it breaks down by category. The largest portion of this revenue is generated by your residential properties, almost $1.3 million. Your commercial is under $300,000, and our land is less than $1,000, so it's not even really worth
The
talking about.
increase in revenue at the new rate is 334, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So based on the proposed rates, it would be $334,000 more than we collected in the current year, or based on the current rates. Now,
Skip another.
we're almost there.
Okay.
Next one. So based on our rates as they are today, the $80 residential, if that's what we carry into 17-18, we're going to have to transfer almost $560,000 from the general fund to make up for the difference in the cost versus what we're collecting. Now, what are we going to do with all this extra revenue? We're going to stop using reserves to fund recurring expenses. We're going to stop transferring large chunks of general fund dollars in there to supplement this service. We're going to maintain the current level of service that we provide everybody now.
No additional staff, no
No
firehouses,
Christmas trees
no
or
raises.
boats or nothing. This is just maintaining what service we're providing right now. It will allow us to maintain our facilities and vehicles appropriately and timely. There's been a lot of times where equipment has gone out of compliance, we're talking safety equipment, and these guys have just used outdated stuff, and it just waited until, and it just never happened. So we'll be able to maintain our facilities and equipment. It puts us in a situation where we can start building up a reserve here and meet our fund balance policy, but it puts us on a path to expand as necessary. We are growing right now, and at some point we are going to need to have additional staff, but we have to get this fund in the financial position to be able to do that when the
Do
time
that
comes.
without having to come back again and say we need
Correct,
another raise
correct.
in the MSPU
Correct.
to hire more staff.
Until when?
Huh?
Until when?
That's what I asked. That foreseeable future?
That's going to be based on how fast we grow.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's not predictable in the emergency services world. It's like some of this the stuff earlier you guys were questioning about where money went. Remember, we had Hermine. It's your fire staff out there cutting trees up out of the roads with Talcott. They're working on overtime. Some of those guys work 4 or 5 days straight. It's unpredictable. But it's not emergency services.
I'm just concerned, I'm not concerned really, but going forward, if we keep the same percentage of expense in relation to the growth, then I don't have any problem with that so much. It's just where the expense are growing percentage-wise greater than the growth. And we should, you follow what I'm saying?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yep. No, and we've had a rough, when I took this over, there were a lot of facilities and equipment.
Oh,
trucks
yeah,
that were
I
neglected.
know that.
So we've had a rough couple of years. But working with Brandy and Mr. Edwards, I mean, this is a solid plan.
Well, you gotta have so many fire trucks, you gotta have all that. I'm talking about basically salaries and people. As long as that percentage stays in the same, as long as that increase stays in the same percentage as growth, then I don't have any problem. But when that exceeds what the growth is, then somebody's, we're padding the books.
And it's we're in our new normal now with all the operational changes that we've talked about that have went on in the last 7 years. We're locked in where we need to be now until we get to the point. But Louis will tell you there's still several times a week that they don't have a truck to send the calls.
Well, that's a necessity.
Right.
It goes back to me, remember when Chief Morgan gave that presentation a couple of years ago and said this, we gotta have this, I think he wanted $130 a year or something. It was some pretty high number. And I remember, Ralph, you asked him, is this the minimum you need to run? Oh, yeah, yep. And we were told that, and it turns out later, that really wasn't the case. And, I
Well,
kind of
and I
got
think
egg on my
that's-
face about it. It was kind of exaggerated. Well, this includes expansion. This doesn't include any expansion. This is strictly, in my mind, what this does is, they're going to spend the same amount of money, roughly, but this offsets spending their reserve in general fund. And this is how the county got in a financial jam several years ago, back 2010, was burning down its reserve and not adequately cutting costs and raising revenue to offset it. And this is trying to avoid that happening to the
Yes,
MSBU
yes.
fund.
Because this, if you don't do something specific within the fund, it affects your decision about ad valorem as well, and PST, and every other revenue you want to talk about. Because if you have to keep making a $560,000 transfer year over year over year, we're not talking one time, you've got to have something else in the general fund to pull that from.
And back to my garbage analogy, we could cut the garbage assessment from $196 down to $96 if we were willing to pay the other $100 out of ad valorem taxes. I'm not willing to do that. I preached over the years I want to get away from ad valorem taxes as much as possible, make it a fee for service type deal. It costs $196 to have garbage service, that's what you pay. It costs $99 to have your house serviced by the fire department, that's what you pay. I'm all for it. As long as they don't come back 2 years from now and say, oh, it should have been this. That's why I like the CPI increase in there.
So,
That's the next thing that's the next and last thing we're going to say. Like we talked about, this fund, this assessment really needs to have a CPI applied each year. And we also intend on pulling that same period of call data, that May 1st to April, and we want to analyze those incident calls again and determine, is our residential rate now, is their use now going down because our commercial is increasing? And we want to shift those costs to who's using the service. And that's all I have, unless you want to walk through the math on the board real quick.
one more question. So you anticipate the only money coming in from the general fund would be the buy-down money? Is that right?
We're going to transfer it directly into the MSBU fund to make up for the gap between the revenue and in 17-18 it's planned to just supplement fund balance. We're going to actually continue to purchase stuff from 1 cent sales tax directly rather than transferring that money in there.
Okay.
And that covers our buy down. You don't have to put it in the MSBU fund. You just have to show that you supported fire
You've
from other
accounted for
funds.
it.
Yeah, and
Yes.
it can also be accumulative.
Yes.
So you've got in your proposed budget an interfund transfer of 208,464.
Yes.
That's from the general fund?
Correct.
So you're saying even with the $99 increase, we're still going to need to transfer 208?
Yes, and we could,
That's the
if we
buy down?
didn't want to set a reserve, but we want to set that reserve so that the end of the year, the fund balance gets a good shot in the arm and it gets back up there so they have some money in cash.
Set
that-
fund
That's
balance
just like we did with the sheriff's fund. It's the same thing. We're going to send an infusion of cash to fund balance, and that's what this is.
This is kind of like burning through
Yeah,
our,
and so you
burning down our
have to,
reserve.
you have to have that budget capacity available to do that. So we intend to transfer that even though, no matter what rates it'll just be more depending on what rates get approved.
Will you send us a chart going forward showing with these numbers what you anticipate that's going to do for the fund balance for the next 2 to 3 years?
Yes,
Because
Yeah.
we've got it going backwards and we've had it in the past, but
I will send
I
you
don't
my
see it.
projection.
Yeah, we've run that, we've made sure we ran a 5-year model on the entire budget with the MSBU like it is, and the general fund.
Yes.
All right.
So do we want to walk through that math, or do y'all want to discuss, or
Call it up.
I don't need it.
call it?
Y'all want a 10-minute break before the meeting?
Yeah.
Yes, sorry about the math.
Hey, I want to tell you,
Hey, we can put it, you can look at it during the break.
Yeah, open the screen so
I
citizens
think
can
this
see
is the first year that you've done this instead of Greg James, so I want to say good job and
Thank you.
appreciate that. You stood up to all of our questions very well, so thank you.
Very good.
Yeah,
Very good,
very
thank you.
good.
Well,
We
I'm
will
lucky
adjourn
I'm gonna hire her.
and start the board meeting at 5 PM.
That's my move.
I hear you.